I knew something was wrong with my brother long before I was willing to say it out loud. That's the part I still feel guilty about. Not because I suspected him, because some part of me recognized it immediately and decided to ignore it. When Daniel came back, he'd been missing for 7 years. 7 years, 3 months, and 11 days, according to my mother, who had counted every single one. The police had officially presumed him dead after the 3rd year. There had been searches, divers, volunteers, cadaver dogs, interviews on local news stations, psychics, tips from 3 different states, and eventually, the slow, administrative exhaustion that happens when nobody finds anything. People stop saying missing. They start saying gone. My mother never did. She kept the porch light on every night until the bulb burned out. Then she replaced it. For 7 years. And then one rainy Thursday in October, Daniel walked back home. No ambulance, no dramatic story, no explanation. He just walked up the driveway wearing the same gray hoodie he'd disappeared in. I remember staring at the sleeve, because there was still a little burn mark near the cuff, from when he'd nearly blown his fingers off with a firecracker as a teenager. The stain was still there. The hoodie looked old, but not 7 years old. That detail lodged in my head immediately. He looked older, obviously, but not enough older. That was the first thing that bothered me. The second was how unsurprised the authorities seemed. The police came. Detectives. Then 2 people from some State Department I had never heard of before. Not FBI. Not social workers. Something else. They spoke to Daniel gently, like they were following a script. Where had he been? He didn't know. Did he remember anything after leaving the gas station that night? No. Did he know how long he'd been gone? No. One of the women nodded calmly and said memory interruption was common in cases like this. Cases like this. I remember that phrase exactly because of how wrong it sounded. Cases like this implied there had been others. At the time, I told myself she probably meant trauma victims or missing persons generally. Now I know she didn't. At first we were just relieved. That's the horrible part. When someone you love comes back from the dead, your brain will forgive almost anything. Daniel moved back into my mother's house within days. People visited constantly during that first week. Neighbors, old family friends, church members, detectives checking in. Everyone kept saying the same thing. You must be so grateful. And we were. Until the little things started happening. Tiny things. The kinds of things you can't accuse someone over without sounding insane. Daniel paused before reacting to emotional moments. Not for long, but just enough. If someone laughed, there was sometimes a delay before he laughed too, like he was catching up half a second late. Sometimes he remembered things slightly wrong. Not big things, just enough to leave a strange feeling behind. He called our elementary school teacher Mrs. Calloway instead of Mrs. Caldwell. He remembered our old dog being buried near the oak tree when she was buried near the fence. He forgot phrases he used to say constantly as a kid. One night he told me, "You always scare easy." But growing up, he never said that. He always used to say, "You jump like a scared rabbit." That's the kind of detail grief can't survive intact. You start wondering if maybe you're the one remembering wrong. And Daniel noticed things too carefully. That became impossible to ignore. He watched people while they spoke, not rudely, intently, like he was studying them, especially my mother. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at her when she wasn't looking, his expression completely blank, almost analytical. Then the moment she noticed him, he'd smile. But sometimes the smile arrived a second too late. He slept rarely, or pretended to. Several nights I found him standing awake in dark rooms, not doing anything, just standing there. Once I woke up around 3 a.m. and found him in the hallway outside my bedroom. He said he couldn't sleep, but he didn't sound embarrassed about it. He sounded like he was reciting the correct response. And then there were the mirrors. At first I thought it was coincidence, but after a while I realized Daniel avoided reflections whenever possible. He angled mirrors away from himself. He kept the medicine cabinet open while brushing his teeth so he wouldn't see his reflection. If he passed the antique mirror near the stairs, he turned his head slightly, not dramatically, subtly, like someone avoiding eye contact. I didn't know what to do with any of this, so naturally, I started paying more attention. I started researching disappearances, then unexplained returns, then forums, archived newspaper articles, missing persons databases, old message boards, and eventually, very late one night, I found the tape. Well, it wasn't actually a physical VHS tape, but it must have been originally. It was a digitized upload, buried inside an archive thread that looked like it had been abandoned years earlier. The title was Missing Persons Reintegration Protocol, Family Observation Edition. The upload had already been removed from the original site, but someone had preserved a copy. I downloaded it around 2 a.m, while Daniel stood outside my bedroom door. I remember that detail clearly because I could see his shadow under the crack of the door while the file downloaded. He wasn't knocking. He was just standing there. When I finally opened the door, he smiled and said he couldn't sleep. Again, there was that tiny delay before the expression appeared, like something inside him had to decide what face to make first. I watched the tape the next day while everyone else was out. The video looked old, late 80s, maybe early 90s, institutional, cheap lighting, wood-paneled room, the kind of government training video designed to be emotionally invisible. The narrator spoke in an unbelievably calm voice the entire time. That calmness was the worst part. He explained that the material was intended for internal personnel involved in family reintegration procedures, following the return of long-term missing persons. He never used words like victim or survivor, only returned individual. That phrase appeared constantly. The narrator explained that returned individuals often retained sufficient memory continuity to avoid early detection. I remember pausing the video after that line. Avoid early detection. Not confusion. Not adjustment. Detection. The tape instructed observers not to confront the returned individual directly, not to ask where they had been, not to discuss the disappearance unless the returned individual initiated the conversation. The narrator said behavioral correction attempts could trigger something called a recognition event. That phrase appeared multiple times throughout the tape, but it was never fully explained. The footage itself was damaged in places, not exaggerated horror movie distortion, just old deterioration. Sections where the image blurred. Moments where the audio crackled and cut out. Sometimes the tape resumed in the middle of sentences. At one point, the narrator explained that direct family members were statistically most likely to observe behavioral inconsistencies, especially siblings. Then the footage glitched briefly before continuing. I remember every symptom the tape listed because every single one matched Daniel. Delayed emotional response, imprecise memory recall, sleep irregularities, observation behavior, avoidance of mirrors, questions regarding grief, attachment, and identity, standing motionless in thresholds or unlit areas. The tape referred to these as common post-return behaviors. Common. Like this happened regularly enough for patterns to exist. One section disturbed me more than anything else. The narrator calmly instructed viewers not to allow the returned individual unsupervised access to family photographs during the first 72 hours. He explained that returned individuals might attempt to establish memory continuity through observation and replication. Replication. That word made my stomach drop. I remember thinking about all the times I'd seen Daniel studying old photos around the house. Not reminiscing. Studying. There was another section where the narrator explained that family members often described returned individuals as quiet, watchful, or not quite themselves. He said these reports should be documented but not validated. Not validated. Like families had already been reporting the same thing for decades. As I kept watching, the tape became gradually more disturbing. Still calm. Still procedural. But darker. The narrator discussed failed reintegrations, recognition events, containment recommendations. At one point, the tape resumed after a damaged section, and the narrator said something that made me physically cold. He said, most returned individuals retained sufficient memory continuity to fully integrate into society. Fully integrate. Like they weren't always discovered. Like some of them lived entire lives unnoticed. That night, I started looking for other cases. And I found them. Not openly. Never openly. But buried underneath old local news articles or forgotten forum posts, there were stories that sounded horribly familiar once you knew what to look for. Missing people returning years later with memory gaps. Families quietly reporting strange behavioral changes. Cases where discussions abruptly stopped online after officials became involved. One story from Oregon described a teenager who vanished during a camping trip and returned 11 months later without signs of exposure or starvation. A woman on an old forum claimed her brother came home after 4 years and no longer slept lying down. Another case mentioned a returned child who became agitated around mirrors. Every story sounded impossible. Every story sounded exactly the same. Then I found the part of the tape that broke me. The narrator began discussing self-recognition. That was the actual term. He explained that in rare cases, returned individuals became aware of inconsistencies in their own identity continuity. The tape never explained exactly what that meant. The narrator listed examples of direct inquiry from returned individuals. Questions like, am I the same person? Did I come back correctly? Do you remember me differently? The tape instructed viewers never to answer these questions truthfully. Instead, they were supposed to repeat approved reassurance phrases. "You are safe. You are home. We are glad you returned." The narrator said confrontation increased the risk of destabilization. Then the tape cut out for several seconds. When it resumed, the audio was partially damaged, but I could still hear him say, "If the returned individual recognizes itself, evacuate immediately." I remember sitting there staring at the paused screen for a very long time after that, because by then I already knew something had changed in Daniel. I just didn't know whether he understood it too. The strangest part was that despite everything, he never seemed malicious. That would have been easier. Instead, he often seemed confused, sad sometimes, like someone trying desperately to perform a role correctly. One night, I found him sitting alone in the kitchen, holding an old photograph of us at Coney Island when we were children. He stared at the image for so long, I eventually asked what he was doing, and he told me very quietly, "Practicing." I asked what he meant. He touched the picture gently and said, "Being him." I still think about the way he said it. Not threatening, not monstrous, almost ashamed. After that, my own memories started changing, or unraveling. I still don't know which. Small things at first. I remember Daniel breaking his arm as a kid. Then I found the hospital photo. It had been me. I remembered him hating peanut butter. My mother swore he loved it. I started watching old home videos trying to prove to myself that my memories were real. Instead, I kept finding details that contradicted me. The tape had warned about this too. Near the end, the narrator explained that prolonged exposure during successful reintegration could result in memory instability among immediate family members, especially siblings. The phrase he used was memory drift, like identity itself became uncertain after enough exposure. I remember one final section very clearly, because the tape quality became noticeably worse there. The image blurred repeatedly, and parts of the narrator's voice vanished beneath static, but I could still understand most of it. He explained that siblings should not remain primary observers following recognition events, because they demonstrated unusually high rates of identity confusion. Then the tape distorted badly for several seconds. When the audio returned, I only caught fragments. May misidentify themselves. Returned prior to documented disappearance. Memory continuity unreliable. I replayed that section over and over. I could never recover the missing words. A few days later, I found an unlabeled VHS tape in a box of old family recordings in the basement. At first, I thought it was unrelated. Then I played it. The footage showed my parents standing at our front door years earlier. My father was holding balloons. My mother was crying. Then the door opened. A child walked inside. Everyone started saying my name. Not Daniel's. Mine. I remember feeling physically numb watching that. Because I don't remember ever disappearing. I don't remember ever coming back. But the tape showed my mother kneeling in front of me exactly the same way she had when Daniel returned, touching my face like she was afraid I'd vanish again. Then the camera shifted briefly, and in the background I saw Daniel, small, confused, watching me. I remember his exact words because they were captured clearly before the tape cut off. He asked, "Why does she look different?" After that, the footage ended abruptly. No explanation. No date. Nothing. I sat in the basement for a long time staring at the blue screen afterward, trying to remember something. Anything. But memory isn't evidence. That was one of the tape's final lines. Memory is not evidence. I kept hearing it in my head. Upstairs, I could hear Daniel and my mother talking quietly in the kitchen. Then, my mother laughed. A real laugh. The kind I hadn't heard in years. And suddenly, I understood something that terrified me more than the tape itself. Whatever Daniel was. Whatever I might be. My mother had already decided it was better than grief. Later that night, I heard footsteps outside the basement door. Slow, careful. Then Daniel spoke softly through the other side. And what frightened me most was how normal he sounded. Not hollow, not distorted, just tired, almost sad. He asked me one question. "Did you find yours?"
If this one got under your skin, there are more waiting. Subscribe to the leather-bound grimoire